Dakota Territory, January 1885. Wind chill 40 below. While every settler on the northern plains kept their cabin walls exposed and visible, one Norwegian homesteader was doing something his neighbors called ignorant. He was burying his cabin under snow. 3 to 5 feet of packed snow, banked deliberately along the north and west walls once the ground froze solid. His neighbors couldn't believe it. They called it peasant nonsense, old-world superstition. Standard frontier wisdom said snow meant dampness, rot, and cold. Good settlers chopped more wood, not stacked snow against their walls. He kept piling it anyway. Then the real cold arrived. 30 below for days at a time. Wind stripping heat faster than stoves could replace it. Exposed cabins couldn't hold warmth. Families burned 8 to 10 cords of firewood and still watched frost form inside on the walls. But that buried cabin, it stayed 10 to 20 degrees warmer, used 40% less wood, and kept his family comfortable through the coldest stretch on record. What did he understand about wind, insulation, and survival that everyone else dismissed as foolishness? And how did the coldest thing on the prairie become a shield? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time so we know where this found you. The Norwegian homesteader stood in the doorway of his 14 by 16-foot log cabin on a January morning in 1885, watching his nearest neighbor approach across frozen prairie grass that crackled underfoot like broken glass. The neighbor stopped 20 feet out, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, and stared at the growing mound of packed snow that now rose 3 feet high along the cabin's north wall. His expression made his opinion clear before he opened his mouth. "You'll rot those logs by spring," the neighbor said. His breath hung white in air cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Snow holds water. Rotter rots wood. You're burying your own house. The Norwegian didn't argue. He turned back to the pile of snow he'd been shaping with a flat shovel, packing it tight against the logs with steady, methodical strokes. His father had taught him this in Valdres, where winter meant survival depended on what you did before the ground locked solid. The lesson was simple. Once the soil froze deep enough that meltwater couldn't seep down to the foundation, snow became a wall. Not a temporary drift. A deliberate barrier. The neighbor watched for another minute, shook his head, and walked back toward his own cabin, a near-identical structure of 6-inch thick pine logs, chinked with clay and moss, standing fully exposed on a slight rise 200 yards east. That cabin followed every rule the neighbor had brought west from Ohio. Walls needed air circulation to prevent rot. Snow against wood meant dampness, mold, and structural failure. Good homesteaders kept their buildings clean and visible, not half-buried like root cellars. By mid-January, the Norwegian's cabin had disappeared behind snow banks that rose 4 feet high on the north side and 5 feet on the west, where prevailing winds hit hardest. He'd left the eaves clear and kept a 2-foot radius open around the stovepipe where it punched through the roof. The south and east walls remained mostly exposed, receiving what little winter sun in the latitude allowed. The work had taken him and his wife the better part of 2 weeks, hauling and packing snow in layers during the coldest part of each day when the crystals were driest and packed tightest. Word spread through the scattered homesteads that dotted the section lines. The Norwegian was burying his cabin like a fool. At the land office in the nearest town, a clerk who also sold lumber and building supplies told arriving settlers to avoid Scandinavian methods. "They don't understand how we build in America," he said. "Snow banking is old country superstition. You want your logs to breathe." The Norwegian's wife, who had grown up in a farmhouse outside Lillehammer, found the criticism strange. In Norway, snow banking was as routine as stacking firewood. Her father had maintained snowbanks around the livestock barn every winter, packing them after the first hard freeze and maintaining them until spring breakup. The animals stayed warmer. Feed lasted longer. Ice in the water troughs melted faster each morning. It wasn't folklore. It was farm work. But this was Dakota Territory, and the Americans who had arrived first set the standards. Exposed log construction dominated the northern plains because it matched what worked in Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, states where winter rarely pushed below zero for more than a few nights at a time. The typical homestead cabin used logs 6 to 8 inches thick, chinked with whatever material was available, and heated with a cast iron stove positioned against an interior wall. Firewood came from creek bottoms or was hauled in by wagon from distant timber claims. Most families planned on 3 to 4 cords for the winter. Sensible, practical, proven. The Norwegian had cut 7 cords and stacked them under a lean-to on the cabin's south side. His neighbors considered this excessive. One older settler, a man who'd survived 3 Dakota winters already, stopped by in late December and gestured at the woodpile. "You planning to sell the extra come spring?" he asked. "Planning to burn it," the Norwegian said. The older man laughed. "You must be cold-blooded. Or you don't know how to run a stove." What the Norwegian knew, what his father and grandfather had known, was that wind did more damage than temperature alone. A cabin at 20 below in still air could be managed. The same cabin at 20 below with a 30-mile-per-hour wind became a convection oven running in reverse, stripping heat through every gap in the chinking, every seam between logs, every place where wood met wood imperfectly. The prairie wind never stopped. It came hard from the northwest in winter, driving across 300 miles of open grassland without a single significant tree to slow it. A 6-inch log wall, fully exposed, offered almost no resistance to that kind of sustained air movement. Snow, however, was mostly air trapped between ice crystals. Packed tight, it eliminated wind penetration entirely. The snowbank didn't insulate the way wool insulated, by trapping body heat in fiber gaps. It insulated by creating a dead air space that stopped convective heat loss cold. The wind could blow at 50 miles per hour against the outer surface of the snow and the wall behind it would feel nothing. The Norwegian tried explaining this once to a group of men gathered at the small general store that doubled as a post office. He described how his father banked snow only after freeze-up, never during thaw periods. How the snow was packed in layers, not piled loose. How the roof had to stay clear to avoid moisture problems and chimney blockage. The men listened politely and then ignored him. One of them, a carpenter who'd built 4 cabins that season, said snow was dead weight on a foundation and would cause settling and structural cracks. By the end of January, the Norwegian's cabin sat half-buried, the snow now frozen solid as plaster, and his reputation as a peculiar foreigner was firmly established. He didn't care. Inside, his wife kept the stove at a moderate burn, feeding 3 times a day instead of constantly. The interior temperature held steady near 45 degrees even on the coldest nights. Frost never formed on the interior walls. The water bucket by the door stayed liquid. At night, they slept under 2 blankets instead of 4, and the fire coasted through till morning without attention. 200 yards away, his neighbor fed his stove every 2 hours, burned through firewood at twice the expected rate, and watched ice form on the nail heads that protruded through the interior log walls. The cabin stayed just warm enough to prevent dangerous cold, but never approached comfort. His children slept in layers near the stove. His wife wrapped herself in quilts to cook breakfast. Neither man spoke about the differences yet. The winter was young, and pride ran deep. But the cold was only beginning. February arrived with temperatures that made January seem mild. The thermometer outside the land office in town registered 30 below on the morning of the 4th, and that was before the wind. By midday, with sustained winds pushing 40 miles per hour out of the northwest, the effective temperature dropped below 50 below zero. Exposed skin froze in under 2 minutes. Breath crystallized instantly. Metal tools left outside became brittle enough to snap. The Norwegian's neighbor burned through half a cord of firewood in 3 days trying to keep his cabin habitable. He fed the stove every 90 minutes around the clock, splitting frozen logs by lantern light at 2 in the morning because the pile inside had run out. His wife stuffed rags into gaps around the door frame and hung blankets over the windows, sacrificing light to reduce drafts. The interior temperature hovered between 25 and 30 degrees during the day, dropping to near 20 at night despite the constant fire. Ice formed on the inside walls wherever nails or metal fixtures conducted cold through the logs. The children slept in a pile near the stove, layered under every quilt and blanket the family owned. 4 miles south, another homesteader ran out of firewood entirely on February 6th. He'd calculated his winter needs based on advice from the land office clerk, 3 cords for a family of 4 in a standard cabin. He'd burned through all 3 by late January. Now he was breaking up furniture and burning fence posts pulled from frozen ground with a crowbar and mallet. His wife wrapped the children in coats and blankets during the day, and they huddled together, barely moving to conserve warmth. By February 8th, they abandoned the cabin and walked 2 miles to a neighbor's dugout, carrying what they could and leaving everything else behind. The cold stretched across the entire northern plains that winter, settling in like a physical presence that refused to leave. Homesteaders who'd survived previous winters with relative ease found themselves struggling. The difference wasn't just the temperature, it was the duration. Week after week of sub-zero cold with no break, no warming trend, no relief. Wood piles that should have lasted until March were gone by mid-February. Livestock frozen in bank sheds and barns. Water had to be melted from snow because wells and pumps were frozen solid 3 feet down. The Norwegian kept his stove running at a steady, moderate pace. He fed it 4 times a day, morning, midday, evening, and once before bed. The fire never roared and never died. Inside the snow-banked cabin, the temperature held between 45 and 50 degrees regardless of what happened outside. His wife cooked meals in relative comfort. The children played on the floor without heavy coats. At night, the family slept under normal bedding and the fire coasted for 8 hours without attention, still showing coals at dawn. The difference was measurable and impossible to ignore. The Norwegian's 7-cord woodpile, which his neighbors had mocked as excessive, was barely half depleted by mid-February. His neighbor's 3-cord supply was nearly gone, supplemented now by anything burnable he could scavenge, old lumber, broken tools, dried grass twisted into bundles. The mathematics were simple and brutal. An exposed cabin in sustained sub-zero wind required constant high-temperature fire to maintain minimal livable conditions. A snow-banked cabin required moderate fire to maintain actual comfort. On February 12th, a blizzard hit that buried section line roads under 3-foot drifts and dropped visibility to arm's length. The wind screamed at 50 miles per hour for 18 straight hours. Temperatures plunged to 35 below. The Norwegian's neighbor made it through the first night by burning everything he had left, including a chair and part of a wooden trunk. By dawn, he was out of fuel. His stove went cold by mid-morning. The interior temperature dropped 10 degrees in 2 hours. He had no choice. He bundled his wife and 2 children into every piece of clothing they owned, wrapped blankets around them, and led them through waist-deep snow toward the Norwegian's cabin. The wind hit them like a wall. The 200 yards took 20 minutes to cross. When they reached the snowbank structure, barely visible except for the stovepipe and the south-facing door, the neighbor pounded with numb fists until the Norwegian opened it. Inside, the contrast was immediate and undeniable. The neighbor's children, shaking with cold, stood in the warm interior and stared. No frost on the walls. No ice on the water bucket. The stove burning at a gentle, even heat that filled the space without roaring. The temperature was warmer than their own cabin had been even with maximum fire. The neighbor said nothing at first. He stood near the door, snow melting off his coat, breathing hard from exertion and cold, and tried to process what he was seeing. The Norwegian's wife brought hot coffee and blankets. The children were seated near the stove and given warm food. The neighbor finally spoke. "How much wood are you burning?" "4 loads a day," the Norwegian said. "Same as November." The neighbor looked at the walls, still not understanding the mechanism but unable to deny the result. His own cabin was burning twice the wood for half the warmth. The difference wasn't stove efficiency or log quality or construction skill. Both cabins were nearly identical in size and materials. The only variable was the snow. 2 days later, the blizzard cleared. The neighbor returned to his own cabin, restarted his stove with borrowed firewood, and spent the next day hauling and packing snow against his north and west walls. He didn't announce what he was doing. He didn't ask for advice. He simply began building the banks, 3 feet high, then 4, packing the snow tight with a flat shovel the way he'd seen the Norwegian do it in January. Within a week, his firewood consumption dropped by 1/3. The interior temperature stabilized above freezing even overnight. The difference was immediate and measurable. By the end of February, 3 other homesteaders in the area were banking snow against their cabins, barns, and outbuildings. No one discussed it openly. No one acknowledged they'd been wrong. They simply started packing snow and stopped criticizing the method. The Norwegian watched this happen without comment. He continued his routine: moderate fire, steady warmth, controlled wood consumption. His 7-cord pile would last through March easily, probably into April if the cold persisted. Around him, the quiet adoption of snow banking spread through necessity rather than persuasion. The method didn't require believers. It only required people cold enough to try anything that might work. The Norwegian's father had explained snow banking to him when he was 12 years old, standing in a farmyard outside Valdres while winter wind cut across the valley. The old man held a chunk of snow in his bare hand and squeezed it until water ran between his fingers. "This is what kills," he said. "Water moves. Water finds wood and rots it. Water freezes in cracks and splits stone." Then he picked up a second chunk of snow, this one frozen solid from weeks of sub-zero cold, and threw it against the barn wall where it shattered like glass. "This is what protects. No water. No movement. Just air trapped in ice." The principle was simple but required understanding the difference between wet snow and frozen snow. Wet snow, packed during thaw periods or mild days above freezing, would melt against the warm side of a cabin wall and seep into the logs. That water would freeze during the next cold snap, expanding in the wood grain and causing splits, cracks, and eventual rot. This was what the American settlers feared when they warned against snow banking. Their assumption was correct for the wrong season. Frozen snow, packed after the ground locked solid and temperatures stayed consistently below 20 degrees, behaved completely differently. It contained almost no liquid water. The ice crystals that formed the structure were separated by air gaps, thousands of tiny pockets that trapped still air and prevented heat movement. When packed tight against a cabin wall, this mass of frozen snow created a dead air barrier that stopped convective heat loss entirely. The wind could blow at any speed against the outer surface and never reach the logs. The snow itself was roughly 10 to 15% solid ice by volume. The remaining 85 to 90% was trapped air, and air was among the best insulators available on the frontier. The Norwegian had packed his snow banks when the temperature was 30 below and falling. Every shovelful was frozen solid before it touched the wall. He'd built the banks in layers, packing each one down before adding the next, creating a structure dense enough to support its own weight without slumping. The result was a barrier 3 to 5 feet thick that eliminated wind penetration completely and reduced heat loss through the wall by more than half. Inside the cabin, the effect was measurable in multiple ways. The stove fire, which had to run hot and constant in January before the banking was complete, now maintained comfortable interior temperatures at a fraction of the burn rate. The Norwegian's wife could let the fire die down to coals overnight and wake to a cabin that was still 40 degrees, cold enough to want the stove relit, but nowhere near freezing. In an exposed cabin, overnight temperatures routinely dropped below 20 degrees even with banked coals, requiring constant attention in middle-of-the-night stoking. The thermal difference showed up in other details. In exposed cabins across the territory, condensation from cooking and breathing froze on interior walls wherever the surface temperature dropped below freezing. This happened along the north wall especially, where outside cold conducted through the logs and created interior frost layers that built up over weeks. Families scraped ice off their walls regularly to prevent dangerous buildup. In the Norwegian snow-banked cabin, the walls stayed warm enough that frost never formed. The temperature gradient between interior and exterior was spread across 3 to 5 feet of snow instead of 6 to 8 inches of wood, and the insulation was effective enough that the interior log surface stayed above freezing even during the coldest nights. The firewood savings were the most dramatic proof. Before banking, the Norwegian had burned through nearly a cord of wood in 3 weeks trying to keep the cabin livable during the coldest part of January. After banking, his consumption dropped to roughly a cord every 5 to 6 weeks while maintaining higher interior temperatures. The mathematics were straightforward. An exposed cabin lost heat continuously through convection. Wind moving across the exterior surface pulled warmth away faster than it could be replaced. A snow-banked cabin lost heat only through conduction, the slow movement of warmth through the insulating mass, which happened at a fraction of the rate. The neighbor who had sought shelter during the blizzard began his own snow banking with skepticism still intact. He packed snow along his north wall first, leaving the other 3 exposed as a test. Within 2 days, he noticed the north side of his cabin interior was noticeably warmer than the south and east walls. Frost that had built up near the ceiling along the north wall began to melt and drip. He completed the west wall banking next, and the improvement compounded. By the time he finished all windward sides, his firewood consumption had dropped by 40% and his interior temperature had stabilized 10 degrees higher than before. Other homesteaders watched these results and began banking their own structures. A farmer 3 miles west packed snow around his livestock barn and found his cattle stopped losing weight during cold snaps. The animals required less feed to maintain body temperature when the barn held steady above freezing instead of dropping to match exterior conditions. Another settler banked his root cellar and discovered his stored potatoes and turnips stayed at a consistent 35 degrees instead of freezing solid during extreme cold or warming dangerously during brief thaws. The snow acted as a thermal buffer in both directions, absorbing temperature swings and maintaining steady conditions. The technique spread through observation rather than instruction. Men saw the Norwegians' woodpile lasting while their own depleted. They felt the difference when entering a snow-banked cabin compared to an exposed one. They measured their own firewood consumption before and after banking and recognized the savings immediately. No theory or explanation was required. The method simply worked, and working methods spread fast on the frontier where failure meant suffering or death. By late February, snow banking had become common enough that the land office clerk stopped warning against it. He didn't endorse it publicly, but he stopped telling new settlers it was ignorant old-world superstition. The evidence was too clear. Cabins with banked snow used less wood, stayed warmer, and showed no signs of the rot and structural damage he'd predicted. The logs weren't suffocating. They weren't rotting. They were simply insulated against the one thing that mattered most on the Dakota prairie in winter, the wind that never stopped and the cold that never quit. The second major blizzard of the winter hit on March 3rd and lasted 4 days. Snow fell continuously for the first 48 hours, accumulating faster than wind could redistribute it. Drifts built up to 6 and 8 feet in low areas and against any vertical surface. The temperature dropped to 40 below on the second night and stayed there. Visibility disappeared completely. Homesteaders who tried to walk from house to barn got lost in their own yards and froze to death 20 feet from shelter. The Norwegian's neighbor, whose cabin was now snowbanked on 3 sides, made it through the first 2 days without incident. His interior stayed warm enough that his family remained comfortable and his firewood consumption stayed manageable. But on the 3rd day, his stove developed a crack in the firebox. A scene that had been holding since installation finally gave way under the constant thermal stress of winter-long burning. Smoke began leaking into the cabin. Within an hour, the interior was unsafe to occupy. He had no spare stove, no way to repair cast iron in a blizzard, and no option except to move his family somewhere else. He could see the Norwegian's cabin from his door, or rather, he could see the general location where he knew it stood. The actual structure was invisible behind horizontal snow and whiteout conditions. The distance was 200 yards across open ground with no landmarks, no fence line, no guide rope. His wife wrapped their 2 children in every blanket they owned. He tied a rope around his own waist and attached the other end to the door frame, planning to use it as a return line if he got disoriented. Then he led his family out into the storm. The wind hit them immediately, strong enough to make forward movement difficult. The cold burned exposed skin. The neighbor kept his family close together, moving slowly, counting steps to maintain direction. Snow accumulated on their clothing faster than they could brush it off. At one point, he lost his sense of direction completely and had to stop, turn in a full circle, and relocate the dim outline of his own cabin behind them before continuing. It took 20 minutes to cover 200 yards. When they finally reached the Norwegians' door and pounded on it, they were coated in snow and shaking from cold and exertion. The Norwegian opened the door and pulled them inside without questions. His wife had already prepared space near the stove and had coffee heating. The children were unwrapped from their frozen blankets and seated in the warmth. The neighbor explained the situation: cracked stove, smoke-filled cabin, no way to repair or replace it until the storm cleared. The Norwegian nodded and gestured toward the corner where his own family slept. "You'll stay here," he said. "However long it takes." The cabin was 14 by 16 feet. It now held 2 families, 6 people total. Under normal circumstances, the crowding would have been uncomfortable but manageable. During a 4-day blizzard with no one able to go outside except for brief trips to the woodpile and outhouse, it became a test of spatial logistics and resource management. The Norwegian's wife organized sleeping arrangements so that both families had space near the stove at night. Meals were prepared in shifts. Children were kept occupied with quiet activities and told repeatedly not to go near the door. The storm continued through the 3rd and 4th days. Outside, the temperature stayed locked at 40 below. Inside the snow-banked cabin, the conditions remained stable. The Norwegian fed his stove 4 times a day as usual, maintaining interior temperature near 45 to 50 degrees. His firewood consumption didn't increase significantly despite the added body heat and cooking needs. The snow banks absorbed the temperature differential and prevented heat loss regardless of interior conditions. The cabin stayed comfortable, dry, and safe. On the 4th night, another homesteader appeared at the door, a man from a cabin a quarter mile south whose stove had run out of firewood and whose family was in danger of freezing. The Norwegian left them in as well. The cabin now held 9 people. Space became genuinely tight. Sleeping arrangements required careful coordination. But the warmth held. The stove continued its steady burn. The snow banks kept the cold outside where it belonged. When the storm finally broke on the morning of March 8th, the contrast between conditions inside and outside the Norwegian's cabin was stark enough that the visiting families stood in the doorway for several minutes just staring. The prairie was transformed into a white desert of drifts and wind-sculpted snow. The neighbor's cabin, 200 yards away, was half buried and uninhabitable until the stove could be repaired. Other structures across the section were damaged or inaccessible. Livestock that had survived in barns and sheds came through only if the buildings had been banked with snow. Those that hadn't were filled with frozen carcasses. The families that had sheltered in the Norwegian's cabin returned to their own homes slowly over the next week as conditions improved and repairs were made. No formal thanks were offered. On the frontier, helping neighbors survive wasn't considered exceptional, it was expected. But the experience had demonstrated something that words couldn't convey. The snow-banked cabin hadn't just been more comfortable or more fuel-efficient. During the worst storm of the winter, it had been the difference between a family staying in their own home and a family freezing to death in it. The neighbor repaired his stove with a metal patch and fire cement obtained from town once the roads cleared. He never rebuilt his cabin without snow banks after that winter. When he added a small barn 2 years later, he designed it with banking in mind, positioning it to take advantage of prevailing wind direction and leaving space around the perimeter for snow to be packed during freeze-up. Other settlers who had sheltered in the Norwegian's cabin during the March storm did the same. The method became standard practice, not through evangelism or official recommendation, but through direct experience of its effectiveness during crisis. By late March, temperatures finally began moderating. The Norwegian 7-cord woodpile still had more than 2 cords remaining. His neighbors, who had started with 3 to 4 cords, had long since run out and were burning scavenged materials or borrowed wood. The difference in fuel efficiency over a full winter was measurable and undeniable. Snow banking had reduced consumption by 35 to 40% while improving comfort and safety. The method wasn't theoretical. It was proven in the most practical way possible, through survival and documented resource use across multiple households in identical conditions. Spring arrived slowly across Dakota Territory. The snow banks that had protected cabins through February and March began to melt in early April, releasing their mass gradually as temperatures climbed above freezing during daylight hours. The Norwegian watched the banks shrink day by day, the packed snow turning to slush and then to water that drained away from the cabin foundation exactly as his father had promised it would. The logs underneath emerged dry and intact, showing no signs of rot or water damage. The feared consequences of burying wood under snow, the dampness, the mold, the structural failure, never materialized because the method had been applied correctly. Snow packed after freeze-up and removed by natural melt during spring thaw left no harmful residue. By late April, the banks were gone completely. The Norwegian examined his cabin walls carefully, checking for any damage the winter might have caused. The logs were sound. The chinking remained intact. If anything, the wood looked better preserved than cabins that had spent the winter fully exposed to wind and temperature extremes. The protective barrier had shielded the structure from the most destructive force on the plains, not cold alone, but the combination of cold and relentless wind that dried and cracked exposed wood faster than seasonal weathering alone. Throughout the spring and summer of 1886, snow banking spread through conversation and observation. Homesteaders who had adopted the method during the previous winter's crisis described their results to neighbors and new arrivals. The stories were specific and measurable. One family reported cutting their firewood consumption from 9 cords to 6. Another described maintaining interior temperatures 15 degrees warmer with the same stove and fuel. A third mentioned that their children slept through the night without waking from cold, something that hadn't happened in previous winters. The technique began appearing in written records. County agricultural agents, tasked with documenting frontier farming methods, noted snow banking in their reports as an effective winter practice for treeless regions. One agent from Yankton wrote in an 1887 bulletin that settlers of Scandinavian origin had introduced a method of banking snow against cabin walls after ground freeze that reduced fuel consumption by as much as 40% and improved interior comfort significantly. The agent recommended the practice for homesteaders in exposed locations where firewood was scarce or expensive. The method proved particularly valuable for root cellars and food storage structures. A properly banked root cellar maintained temperatures between 32 and 38 degrees throughout the winter, cold enough to prevent spoilage but warm enough to prevent freezing. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, and other root vegetables stored in banked cellars lasted until spring without loss. And banked cellars either froze solid during extreme cold, destroying the stored food, or warmed too much during brief thaws, causing rot and premature sprouting. The consistent temperature regulation provided by snow banking extended food supplies and reduced winter hunger significantly. Livestock operations adopted snow banking for barns and animal shelters. Cattle and horses kept in banked structures maintained body weight better during winter because they burn less energy staying warm. Milk production from dairy cows remained more consistent. Chickens continued laying eggs in banked coops when those in exposed structures stopped entirely. The improvements were economically significant enough that commercial operations began including snow banking in their winter management plans as standard practice rather than experimental technique. The Norwegian himself never promoted the method beyond explaining it when asked. He continued farming his claim, built a larger barn in 1888 with snow banking designed into the structure's placement and dimensions, and gradually became known in the area as someone who understood cold weather construction. Younger homesteaders occasionally stopped by to ask questions about winter preparation. He gave the same advice his father had given him: wait for hard freeze, pack the snow tight, keep the roof clear, bank on the windward sides. The instructions were simple because the method was simple. It required no special tools, no purchased materials, and no expertise beyond understanding when and how to apply it. By the 1890s, snow banking appeared regularly in homesteading guides and agricultural extension publications distributed throughout the northern plains. The Dakota farmer mentioned it in an 1893 article about winter fuel conservation. The University of Minnesota Agricultural Extension included it in a bulletin on frontier building techniques in 1896. The method was no longer controversial or ethnically marked. It had become absorbed into regional common sense, one of many practical adaptations settlers made to survive in an environment that punished mistakes and rewarded functional knowledge regardless of its origin. The technique persisted in rural areas well into the 20th century, particularly in regions where fuel remained expensive and winters stayed harsh. Farmers banked snow around outbuildings, storage sheds, and animal shelters as routine winter work. The practice declined only as central heating, improved insulation materials, and rural electrification made temperature control less dependent on passive methods. Even then, some agricultural operations continued banking snow around structures used for cold storage, recognizing that the thermal stability it provided was difficult to replicate with mechanical systems. Modern emergency survival manuals occasionally reference snow banking as a field expedient insulation method for temporary shelters in extreme cold. The thermal principles remain identical to those the Norwegian's father explained in a farmyard in Valdres decades before the Dakota Territory existed. Snow is mostly trapped air. Propped air stops heat movement. Proper application requires frozen conditions to prevent water damage. The method works because the physics work, and physics don't change with geography or time. The Norwegian died in 1912 at age 68, having farmed the same Dakota claim for more than 30 years. His cabin, expanded twice and eventually replaced with a larger frame house, had survived every winter since 1885 without significant damage. The knowledge he'd brought from Norway and applied to an American prairie had been tested under the worst conditions the northern plains could produce and had proven itself completely. The winter of 1885 to 1886 became part of local memory as the season when snow banking changed from foreign superstition to accepted practice, proved not through argument but through survival, the only form of proof that mattered on the frontier.